Hey, super learners, coming back to you from the classroom. So we're going to read one of our Martin Luther King books again, just kind of go a little bit deeper and really think about why he was so important, not just then, but even now still. So we're going to read a second time a picture book of Martin Luther King Jr., and it is written by David A. Adler and illustrated by Robert Casilla. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of America's great leaders. He was a powerful speaker, and he spoke out against laws which kept Black people out of many schools and jobs. He led protests and marches demanding fair laws for all people. Okay, so if you remember, protests is when a protest is when you stand up for something you believe in, and it's in a peaceful way. Kind of the same thing with marches. You're making a statement, sharing what you believe, but it's in a peaceful way. And fair laws for everybody. That means everybody gets the same for what is fair. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th. And there's Dr. King. Take two. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. Martin's father was a pastor. His mother had been a teacher. Martin had an older sister, Willie Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel. Young Martin liked to play baseball, football, and basketball. He liked to ride his bicycle and to sing. He often sang in his father's church. So here's Martin and his brother, Alfred Daniel, and his sister, Willie Christine. Young Martin played in his backyard with his friends. One day, he was told that two of his friends would no longer play with him because they were white and he was Black. Martin cried. He didn't understand why the color of his skin should matter to anyone. Martin's mother told him that many years ago, Black people were brought in chains to America and sold as slaves. She told him that long before Martin was born, the slaves had been set free. However, there were still some people who did not treat Black people fairly. There's that word fair again. In Atlanta, where Martin lived, and elsewhere in the United States, there were white-only signs. Black people were not allowed in some parks, pools, hotels, restaurants, and even schools. Blacks were kept out of many jobs. So if you remember from the video that we watched last week, there were playgrounds for Black people and playgrounds for white people. And usually the playgrounds or even the schools and restaurants for the Black people were not as good quality as the ones for white people. So that's where that fairness comes in. They're not having the same things just because somebody or some people think that they're less than. Not cool. Martin learned to read at home before he was old enough to start school. All through his childhood, he read books about Black leaders, and we'll talk about a couple of them in about a month. So we have Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and George Washington Carver, all very famous and important African-American heroes. Martin was a good student. He finished high school 2 years early and was just 15 when he entered Morehouse College in Atlanta. Most people are like 17 or 18 when they finish high school. So when they say he finished 2 years early, he really did. At college, Martin decided to become a minister, just like his dad. After Martin graduated from Morehouse, he studied for a doctorate at Boston University. So like right now, Miss A is in school for her master's. And that's where I went to college and I graduated, but I want to learn a little bit more and be a little bit smarter so I can help more people. So that's the next level up. And then what Dr. King did is he went the next and highest level up for your doctorate. That's where you know a whole bunch of information about a lot of stuff in this thing in one particular area. While he was there, he met Coretta Scott. She was studying music. They fell in love and married. In 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. began his first job as a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama. The next year, Rosa Parks, a Black woman, was arrested in Montgomery for sitting in the white-only section of a bus. So if you remember from our other story, Rosa probably had a long day at work and she was tired. So she sat on the bus in the white-only section. And then a white man got on the bus and he said, you need to get up. I'm going to sit here. And she said, no. And he was like, oh, well, you can't tell me no, blah, blah. This is the white only area, blah, all angry and stuff. And she just sat there very politely. She wasn't angry. She didn't get fussy or anything. She's very politely, no. So she stood up for herself in a polite and peaceful way. And as we know, what happened to her? She got arrested. Yep. We'll be talking about her later. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a protest. Blacks throughout the city refused to ride the buses. Now, when you refuse a service like the bus service, in order to make a change, it's called a boycott. Can you say boycott? Yeah, so you refuse a service in order to make a change. Dr. King said, there comes a time when people get tired of being kicked out. And if you look on the sign, it says, boycott public buses, equal rights. So they would bring big signs like that to these protests and marches. One night, while Dr. King was at a meeting, someone threw a bomb into his house. Martin's followers were angry. They wanted to fight. Martin told them to go home peacefully. We must love our white brothers, he said. We must meet hate with love. So there's one of Martin's big words, love. The bus protest lasted almost a year. When it ended, there were no more white-only sections on buses. That means everybody could sit wherever they want, as they should. Dr. King decided to move back to Atlanta in 1960. There, he continued to lead peaceful protests against white-only waiting rooms, lunch counters, and restrooms. So they even had separate bathrooms for Black people and white people. And he was like, there's no point. You might as well just all have one for everybody. He led many marches for freedom. Two more of the words, peaceful and freedom. And like I said, they used to bring all these signs. So it says, we march for jobs for all now, end segregated rules in public schools. Do you remember what segregated means? Separate. Good. Segregate means separate. We demand an end to bias. Now, when you have bias or you are biased, that means you lean one way. You have an opinion about something. So if I were to say, I like brown hair the best because I have brown hair and it's just the most beautiful thing ever. That's my opinion, something I believe in. But somebody else may say, well, I like gray hair the best, or I like blonde hair the best. And people have different opinions. And we're going to talk more about that later this year when we have opinions and what they mean and how we can persuade people to convince them to believe or think your opinion. Let's see. We demand voting rights now. Back then, Black people were not allowed to vote. So recently we voted for our new president, and today we're going to be, Mr. Biden is going to be inaugurated as the new president. Basically, he's going to be checked in as the president today. So back then, Black people weren't allowed to vote, but today, Black people are allowed to vote. Everybody's allowed to vote if you're 18 and over, and you have that freedom, that opportunity to choose what you want, and in this case, voting. We demand decent housing now. So kind of the same thing about the playgrounds and the schools. If you lived in a Black community, you had less quality. So not as good playgrounds, houses, apartments, water fountains, schools. But if you lived in a white-only neighborhood, then you had better quality things. So a lot going on this page, I know. In 1963, Dr. King led the biggest march of all, the March on Washington. More than 200,000 Black and white people followed him. I have a dream, he said in his speech. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, who they are on the inside, not what they look like on the outside. The next year, in 1964, Dr. King was awarded one of the greatest honors any man can win, the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's, like I said, I think before, it's a very hard prize to win. You have to work very hard and make a big change. The country was changing. New laws were passed. Remember, laws are those important rules that everybody has to follow. Blacks could go to the same schools as whites. They could go to the same stores, restaurants, and hotels. White-only signs were against the law. So now these signs are coming down because it's breaking the rules. Dr. King told his followers to protest peacefully, but there were some riots and some violence. Now remember, if a protest turns into, if a protest starts to become violent, then it's no longer a protest. It's what we call a riot, and that's where people are getting hurt. They could be breaking things and stealing things, and it's just not a good situation. It's no longer peaceful, and it's no longer doing the job that it was supposed to do. And it's setting a bad example too. It's like throwing a tantrum, like a temper tantrum, like 2-year-olds, I want, and they're on the floor and crying and fussing. And that's like a kid version of like a riot. So the protest is when you're walking, you're talking, you're trying to make a change in a peaceful way. And a riot is when it turns violent. People are stealing, people are getting hurt, breaking rules, not a good situation. Protest peacefully, good. Riots, bad. And of course, as you can see, people were getting arrested. Then, in April 1968, Dr. King went to Memphis, Tennessee. He planned to march so Black and white garbage workers could get the same pay for the same work. On April 4th in Memphis, Dr. King stood outside his motel room. Another man, James Earl Ray, was hiding nearby. He pointed a rifle at Dr. King. He fired the gun. An hour later, Dr. King was dead. Several of you have asked me about this. And this is where we are really lucky to work in a Catholic school, to be in a Catholic school where we can talk about God and God's love for us. And several of you have asked me, why would this man shoot Dr. King? Dr. King was a great guy. And this is where I get to pull God into our story and say there are some people, it is kind of sad. There are some people who just don't know about God and God's love for them and for everyone, all creation. And some people just have a whole bunch of hatred and just ugliness in their heart. And when you don't know God and about God's love, you can make some really bad choices. So that's what happened with this man. He made a really bad choice because he didn't know about God. And, you know, there are still people that make bad choices, and we just have to pray for them and pray for peace and pray for an openness that they can kind of see what God's love can do for them. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a world free of hate, prejudice, and violence. That means a world free of, that means a world without those things, hate, prejudice, and violence. Carved on the stone, which marks his grave, are the words, "I'm free at last," which was part of his big I Have a Dream speech. At the end, it says, free at last, thank God Almighty, I am free at last. And that was a picture book of Martin Luther King Jr. I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about what the times were way back then, and how things are different now, and how we can continue to make a change now in a peaceful way. So I'll see you guys later. Toodaloo.